A few hours ago, that operation was completed. More than 123,000 people have been safely flown out of Afghanistan. That includes about 6,000 American citizens. This has been a massive military, diplomatic, and humanitarian undertaking, one of the most difficult in our nation's history, and an extraordinary feat of logistics and coordination under some of the most challenging circumstances imaginable. Many, many people made this possible. I want to commend our outstanding diplomats who worked around the clock and around the world to coordinate the operation. They volunteered for duty at the Kabul airport. They flew to transit countries to help process thousands of Afghans bound for the United States. They deployed to ports of entry and American military bases to welcome Afghans to their new homes. They staffed a 24/7 task force here in Washington, overseen by Deputy Secretary Brian McKeon. And they built a list of Americans possibly seeking to leave Afghanistan, then worked to contact every single one of them repeatedly, making 55,000 phone calls, sending 33,000 emails since August 14th. They solved problem after problem to keep the mission moving forward. They did this because for the thousands of State Department and USAID employees who've served in Afghanistan in the past 20 years, this evacuation operation was very personal. Many worked hand in hand for years with Afghan partners, many of whom became trusted friends. We also lost cherished members of our foreign service community in Afghanistan. We'll never forget them. Helping Americans, our foreign partners who've been by our side for 20 years, and Afghans at risk at this critical moment was more than just a high-stakes assignment for our team. It was a sacred duty. And the world saw how our diplomats rose to the challenge with determination and heart. U.S. service members in Kabul did heroic work, securing the airport, protecting civilians of many nationalities, including tens of thousands of Afghans, and airlifting them out. They're also providing vital support right now, caring for Afghans on military bases in Europe, the Middle East, and here in the United States. We've seen pictures of U.S. service members at the Kabul airport cradling babies, comforting families. That's the kind of compassionate courage our men and women in uniform exemplify. They carried out this mission under the constant threat of terrorist violence. And 4 days ago, 11 Marines, 1 Navy medic, and 1 soldier were killed by a suicide bomber at the airport gate, as well as scores of Afghans. Nearly all of them were in their early 20s, just babies or toddlers on September 11th, 2001. These deaths are a devastating loss for our country. We at the State Department feel them deeply. We have a special bond with the Marines. The first person that you see when you visit an American embassy is a Marine. They guard our diplomatic missions. They keep us safe around the world. We couldn't do our jobs without them. And we will never forget their sacrifice, nor will we forget what they achieved. The most exceptional among us perform a lifetime's work of service in a short time here on Earth. So it was for our exceptional brothers and sisters who died last week. Finally, I want to thank our allies and partners. This operation was a global endeavor in every way. Many countries stepped up with robust contributions to the airlift, including working by our side at the airport. Some are now serving as transit countries, allowing evacuees to be registered and processed on the way to their final destinations. Others have agreed to resettle Afghan refugees permanently, and we hope more will do so in the days and weeks ahead. We're truly grateful for their support. Now, U.S. military flights have ended, and our troops have departed Afghanistan. A new chapter of America's engagement with Afghanistan has begun. It's one in which we will lead with our diplomacy. The military mission is over. A new diplomatic mission has begun. So here's our plan for the days and weeks ahead. First, we built a new team to help lead this new mission. As of today, we've suspended our diplomatic presence in Kabul and transferred our operations to Doha, Qatar, which will soon be formally notified to Congress. Given the uncertain security environment and political situation in Afghanistan, it was the prudent step to take. And let me take this opportunity to thank our outstanding Chargé d'Affaires in Kabul, Ambassador Ross Wilson, who came out of retirement in January 2020 to lead our embassy in Afghanistan and has done exceptional, courageous work during a highly challenging time. For the time being, we will use this post in Doha to manage our diplomacy with Afghanistan, including consular affairs, administering humanitarian assistance, and working with allies, partners, and regional and international stakeholders to coordinate our engagement and messaging to the Taliban. Our team there will be led by Ian McCarty, who served as our Deputy Chief of Mission in Afghanistan for this past year. No one's better prepared to do the job. Second, we will continue our relentless efforts to help Americans, foreign nationals, and Afghans leave Afghanistan if they choose. Let me talk briefly about the Americans who remain in Afghanistan. We made extraordinary efforts to give Americans every opportunity to depart the country, in many cases talking and sometimes walking them into the airport. Of those who self-identified as Americans in Afghanistan who are considering leaving the country, we've thus far received confirmation that about 6,000 have been evacuated or otherwise departed. This number will likely continue to grow as our outreach and arrivals continue. We believe there are still a small number of Americans, under 200 and likely closer to 100, who remain in Afghanistan and want to leave. We're trying to determine exactly how many. We're going through manifests and calling and texting through our lists, and we'll have more details to share as soon as possible. Part of the challenge with fixing a precise number is that there are long-time residents of Afghanistan who have American passports and who were trying to determine whether or not they wanted to leave. Many are dual citizen Americans with deep roots and extended families in Afghanistan who have resided there for many years. For many, it's a painful choice. Our commitment to them and to all Americans in Afghanistan and everywhere in the world continues. The protection and welfare of Americans abroad remains the State Department's most vital and enduring mission. If an American in Afghanistan tells us that they want to stay for now, and then in a week or a month or a year, they reach out and say, "I've changed my mind," we will help them leave. Additionally, we've worked intensely to evacuate and relocate Afghans who worked alongside us and are at particular risk of reprisal. We've gotten many out, but many are still there. We will keep working to help them. Our commitment to them has no deadline. Third, we will hold the Taliban to its pledge to let people freely depart Afghanistan. The Taliban is committed to let anyone with proper documents leave the country in a safe and orderly manner. They said this privately and publicly many times. On Friday, a senior Taliban official said it again on television and radio, and I quote, "Any Afghans may leave the country, including those who work for Americans, if they want and for whatever reason there may be," end quote. More than half the world's countries have joined us in insisting that the Taliban let people travel outside Afghanistan freely. As of today, more than 100 countries have said that they expect the Taliban to honor travel authorizations by our countries. And just a few short hours ago, the United Nations Security Council passed a resolution that enshrines that responsibility, laying the groundwork to hold the Taliban accountable if they renege. So the international chorus on this is strong, and it will stay strong. We will hold the Taliban to their commitment on freedom of movement for foreign nationals, visa holders, at-risk Afghans. Fourth, we will work to secure their safe passage. This morning, I met with the foreign ministers of all the G7 countries, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Canada, Italy, Japan, as well as Qatar, Turkey, the European Union, and the Secretary General of NATO. We discussed how we will work together to facilitate safe travel out of Afghanistan, including by reopening Kabul's civilian airport as soon as possible. And we very much appreciate the efforts of Qatar and Turkey in particular to make this happen. This would enable a small number of daily charter flights, which is a key for anyone who wants to depart from Afghanistan moving forward. We're also working to identify ways to support Americans, legal permanent residents, and Afghans who have worked with us and who may choose to depart via overland routes. We have no illusion that any of this will be easy or rapid. This will be an entirely different phase from the evacuation that just concluded. It will take time to work through a new set of challenges, but we will stay at it. John Bass, our former ambassador to Afghanistan, who returned to Kabul 2 weeks ago to help lead our evacuation efforts at the airport, will spearhead our ongoing work across the State Department to help American citizens and permanent residents, citizens of allied nations, special immigrant visa applicants, and Afghans at high risk, if any of those people wish to depart Afghanistan. We're deeply grateful for all that John did in Kabul, for his continued commitment to this mission, as well as the extraordinary consular officers who were serving by his side. Fifth, we will stay focused on counterterrorism. The Taliban has made a commitment to prevent terrorist groups from using Afghanistan as a base for external operations that could threaten the United States or our allies, including Al-Qaeda and the Taliban's sworn enemy, ISIS-K. Here, too, we will hold them accountable to that commitment. But while we have expectations of the Taliban, that doesn't mean we will rely on the Taliban. We'll remain vigilant in monitoring threats ourselves, and we'll maintain robust counterterrorism capabilities in the region to neutralize those threats if necessary, as we demonstrated in the past few days by striking ISIS facilitators and imminent threats in Afghanistan, and as we do in places around the world where we do not have military forces on the ground. Let me speak directly to our engagement with the Taliban across these and other issues. We engaged with the Taliban during the past few weeks to enable our evacuation operations. Going forward, any engagement with a Taliban-led government in Kabul will be driven by one thing only: our vital national interests. If we can work with a new Afghan government in a way that helps secure those interests, including the safe return of Mark Frerichs, a U.S. citizen who's been held hostage in the region since early last year, and in a way that brings greater stability to the country and region and protects the gains of the past 2 decades, we will do it. But we will not do it on the basis of trust or faith. Every step we take will be based not on what a Taliban-led government says, but what it does to live up to its commitments. The Taliban seeks international legitimacy and support. Our message is any legitimacy and any support will have to be earned. The Taliban can do that by meeting commitments and obligations on freedom of travel, respecting the basic rights of the Afghan people, including women and minorities, upholding its commitments on counterterrorism, not carrying out reprisal violence against those who choose to stay in Afghanistan, and forming an inclusive government that can meet the needs and reflect the aspirations of the Afghan people. Sixth, we will continue our humanitarian assistance to the people of Afghanistan. The conflict has taken a terrible toll on the Afghan people. Millions are internally displaced. Millions are facing hunger, even starvation. The COVID-19 pandemic has also hit Afghanistan hard. The United States will continue to support humanitarian aid to the Afghan people. Consistent with our sanctions on the Taliban, the aid will not flow through the government, but rather through independent organizations such as UN agencies and NGOs. And we expect that those efforts will not be impeded by the Taliban or anyone else. And seventh, we will continue our broad international diplomacy across all these issues and many others. We believe we can accomplish far more and exert far greater leverage when we work in coordination with our allies and partners. Over the last 2 weeks, we've had a series of intensive diplomatic engagements with allies and partners to plan and coordinate the way ahead in Afghanistan. I've met with the foreign ministers of NATO and the G7. I've spoken one-on-one with dozens of my counterparts. Last week, President Biden met with the leaders of the G7 countries, and Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman has been convening a group of 28 allies and partners from all regions of the world every other day. Going forward, we'll coordinate closely with countries in the region and around the world, as well as with leading international organizations, NGOs, and the private sector. Our allies and partners share our objectives and are committed to working with us. I'll have more to say on these matters in the coming days. The main point I want to drive home here today is that America's work in Afghanistan continues. We have a plan for what's next. We're putting it into action. This moment also demands reflection. The war in Afghanistan was a 20-year endeavor. We must learn its lessons and allow those lessons to shape how we think about fundamental questions of national security and foreign policy. We owe that to future diplomats, policymakers, military leaders, service members. We owe that to the American people. But as we do, we will remain relentlessly focused on today and on the future. We'll make sure we're finding every opportunity to make good on our commitment to the Afghan people, including by welcoming thousands of them into our communities, as the American people have done many times before, with generosity and grace throughout our history. In this way, we'll honor all those brave men and women from the United States and many other countries who risked or sacrificed their lives as part of this long mission right up to today. Thanks for listening.
The United States Secretary of State there, Antony Blinken, speaking at the U.S. State Department in Washington, D.C. His remarks coming at the end of a day which saw several major developments concerning Afghanistan here in the United States. Earlier, United States military commanders announced that the last U.S. troops had left that country after a 20-year war. We heard Secretary of State Antony Blinken there tell us that he would like to thank the military as well as U.S. diplomats as well as allies and partners over the last few days, which saw something like 123,000 people airlifted out of Kabul to countries around the world, and also saw 6,000 Americans being airlifted out of Kabul as well. Earlier, we heard from the U.S. Commander, Central Command here in the United States. We heard from General Kenneth McKenzie, the Commander of Troops. The Pentagon said that a military drone, and this is what the General had to say. Let's listen.
I'm here to announce the completion of our withdrawal from Afghanistan and the end of the military mission to evacuate American citizens, third country nationals, and vulnerable Afghans. The last C-17 lifted off from Hamid Karzai International Airport on August 30th, this afternoon, at 3:29 p.m. East Coast time. And the last manned aircraft is now clearing the airspace above Afghanistan.
Well, for more now on the completion of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Potomac, Maryland, is Nadia Hashimi. She's an Afghan-American pediatrician, author, and women's rights activist. From Columbus, Ohio, Peter Mansoor is a retired U.S. Army colonel who served in Iraq and is the chair of military history at the Ohio State University. Saeed Khan is a lecturer of Near East and Asian Studies at Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan. And here in Washington, D.C., Ahmed Shah Mohibi is the founder and president of Rise to Peace and has worked tirelessly to get families out of Afghanistan. Ahmed Shah Mohibi, let me start with you. As I said, your organization works in Afghanistan. You've been trying to get families out of there over the last few days. We just heard there from the U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. What did you make of what he had to say?
Well, the war started there, ended there. 20 years, a lot of gains, achievements, a lot of C-130s, equipments, Humvees, tanks, machineries, M4, everything. We gave it all to the Taliban. Of course, the U.S. is going to start a new diplomatic chapter with Afghanistan, and Humanitarian will continue. But I just feel that 20 years, it was just a waste of time. Over 241,000 Afghans lost their lives, 2,461 Americans, including the 13 Marines, lost their lives, and thousands of international forces. I think it's just a war that started, ended there, would just went back to zero, square zero. We built on a lot of Afghan prosecutors, judges. We hired judges to put these Taliban behind the bars. Now we left them, we build on them. It's between the high and dry. So giving them high hopes that we will take you out, and all these people are left alone there. American citizens, green card holders. So the administration ended the war of the three presidents and thinking to build a strong Afghan institution failed. But I think the American intention was really good in the beginning of killing Osama bin Laden and bring some democracy in Afghanistan. But the whole operation from 2001 all the way now Even the exit has been a disaster. We built a corrupt system in Afghanistan. The president fled with dollars. His soldiers were wild at the battlefield. The unfairness and social injustices were at high. Violence went really high. At the end, we gave everything to the Taliban. So I'm just really, disappointed and also devastated at the strongest 300,000 Afghan army we built on all the equipment we gave it to them. And again, Anand, it's really hard. You cannot simply trust an insurgency group just by having them making promises. You know, yesterday, one of the top Osama bin Laden aide, he was just escorted into Nangarhar, Jalalabad province. How they have cut ties with Al Qaeda while their commander, top Osama bin Laden aide, is in Nangarhar province right now. ISIS is growing. So I think we need to be more smart and focus on, investing in intelligence rather than listening to the promise of the Taliban.
Peter Mansoor, welcome to the show. What is your opinion on the manner in which the United States left Afghanistan, and on what our other guest, Ahmad Shah Mohibi, just told us, that actually nothing had been achieved? This was a total waste of time.
Well, certainly the last 20 years could have been conducted better. We lost the war. I mean, we have to face up to that fact. As to whether it was worth it or not, we're going to have to see what the Taliban does. If they actually make good on their word that Afghanistan will not be used as a base for international terror, then perhaps something good will have come of the conflict. It certainly was a disaster for the Afghan people, however. In terms of the withdrawal, I think this administration basically flubbed it. They announced in the spring, at the beginning of the fighting season, that they would withdraw U.S. forces, and knowing full well the Afghan security forces were totally reliant on U.S. logistics and air power and advisors to function properly. And so it should have been no surprise to the Biden administration when we withdrew those underpinnings for the Afghan security forces that they fell apart. And then on top of that, we didn't have a withdrawal plan for our citizens, for foreign nationals, and especially for those Afghans who are now vulnerable to Taliban retaliation. But I will say this, I mean, we have withdrawn 123,000 people, 6,000 of them Americans, but most of them Afghans. And this far exceeds the number that was initially vetted, we would withdraw 27,000 translators. So we have brought a lot of people out of harm's way, and we'll see if we can get more in the days and weeks ahead.
Peter, this is being billed as the end of the war. Isn't it just symbolically the end of the war? The United States is removing its physical presence from Afghanistan, but the war actually continues in a different way, doesn't it? It's now called Over the Horizon. The United States retains the right and the ability to conduct this war from the air.
Well, there's actually two wars that continue. One is the war on terror, if you will. It's going to be very difficult for the United States to hit targets in Afghanistan now without bases in the region. Flying drones in or manned aircraft from outside, from the Arabian Sea, for instance, requires multiple refuelings. And so they'll be reserved for only the very highest value targets. But there's another war that's going to begin, and that's the war of the Taliban against ISIS-K on who's going to control Afghanistan going forward. So for the Taliban, be careful what you wish for. Yes, you won the war, now you're the government, and now you have an insurgency that's going to fight you. So there are multiple conflicts that are going to continue from this point on.
Yeah, that's right. There are analysts, Peter, who believe that this could end up in there being a brutal civil war in Afghanistan. There's also resistance forces, which we understand have gathered in the northern part of the country. There are people here in the United States as well who are saying that they should receive assistance from the United States. I mean, could we see more conflict and violence in the country in the weeks and months ahead?
Well, it's very much, it's very possible. There is a small resistance movement that has formed in a traditional home ground for resistance movements in Afghanistan, north of Kabul. We'll see what comes of that. They say that they don't really want a civil war, that they're forming this movement so that the Taliban will form an inclusive government. That remains to be seen as well. But you do have people on the ground there like Abdullah and Hamid Karzai, who were in the previous civilian governments who are negotiating with the Taliban. So perhaps the Taliban will be a little bit more inclusive going forward, and they can stem a civil war before it starts.
Saeed Khan, the United States is putting a very brave face in this, despite the fact that, as Peter just pointed out, they have in fact lost the war. What do you make of the developments of the past few weeks?
Well, one can only really lose a war if one has actually defined what the mission is. And I think part of the problem is that after the defeat of Al-Qaeda, there really wasn't a coherent and clear message that was given as to what the U.S. purpose was within Afghanistan. And when it gets into then nation building, as we saw with the support for a variety of civilian governments, whether it was Hamid Karzai, Abdullah, or more recently Ashraf Ghani, we see the flaws and the failures in that system. So I think the United States is going to have to do a little bit of soul searching, as it did with the comparisons, of course, being made to 46 years ago with the fall of Saigon, that what then became the mission of the United States in Indochina. Over there, of course, it was the inheritance of a conflict that the French left behind, which didn't go the way that the United States certainly had ever predicted that it wanted it to go. And similarly, with Afghanistan, what began as something that it was compelled to do with fighting Al-Qaeda, which it was relatively successful in being able to neutralize. From that point on, how do we then measure staying longer than what was both expected and really what was necessary? At this point, I think the United States needs to then recognize what are the other players in the region, what are their interests, and then make a decision about whether Afghanistan needs to continue to be then the venue and the forum for continued proxy wars, just simply with new adversaries in the region. If the U.S. can move toward a more negotiated, a more pragmatic perspective when it comes to Afghanistan, not only can it then provide for the U.S. A more coherent understanding of where it has gone and where it can go, and also hopefully provide some level of stability for Afghanistan itself.
Saeed, the United States believes that it still has a role to play in Afghanistan. In fact, we just heard Secretary of State Antony Blinken say that America's work will continue in Afghanistan. Does it have any credibility? Does it have a role to play in Afghanistan from now on?
It has a very limited role to play diplomatically and politically in Afghanistan for the very reason that you mentioned, the questionable credibility and legitimacy that it has, along with the fact that, again, there are others who are waiting in the wings who have already cultivated legitimacy and credibility with the Taliban. China, for example, has been conducting high-level negotiations with the Taliban for far longer than the United States was at the end of the Trump administration in Doha. Similarly, Russia has its own designs and aspirations in the region. And of course, these are the two most proximate and powerful forces in the region. But counterterrorism, as Secretary Blinken said, is still a specter that exists. And again, in order for the U.S. to maintain some kind of legitimacy and mission purpose, it is going to have to deal with the Taliban if the real mission is to neutralize forces like ISIS-K and the possible reemergence of Al-Qaeda.
Nadia Hashimi, thanks so much for being with us on the show. Great to have you. One of the things that Secretary Blinken also said in that address he made just a short while ago was that the Taliban will be held to the pledges that they have made. And among those pledges, the Taliban have said that they will allow free passage of people who want to leave Afghanistan and travel to other countries. They also promised to respect women's rights, including the right for women and girls to be educated, to forgive those who collaborated with the United States in the war against them, and to ensure that Afghanistan doesn't in future become a haven again for terrorist groups. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that the Taliban will actually stay with those pledges?
it's really hard to believe that any of that will be honored when the reports that I'm hearing from people that I'm in contact with on the ground in Afghanistan say that they are not allowing safe passage, that they've been kicking, fighting back, and even shooting at people who are trying to make their way to the airport. That while in some areas they may be allowing girls and women to either go to school or university or their workplaces, in many other areas they are hunting down women who have been in leadership roles and in very significant civil society roles. So, you know, it's a very mixed message to say that we're going to believe and hold the Taliban accountable. How are we going to do that? How are we going to do that if we don't have eyes and ears on the ground, and if we are just, as someone mentioned earlier, just having a deafening silence from what's happening in the provinces as well?
Yeah,
Everyone
Nadia,
has been very willing.
The United States says that the leverage that it has over the Taliban is the fact that the Taliban will need aid, financial aid from the rest of the world community to be able to govern in Afghanistan. One other bit of leverage is that the United States can withhold international recognition if the Taliban doesn't stick to its promises. I mean, do you think they are sensitive, the Taliban, sensitive to those threats from the United States?
In terms of international recognition, I don't think the Taliban really want or coveting the international recognition from all nations. I think there are probably a select few that they're really looking to in order to maintain their funding, their shelter, and some of their safe havens. So I really don't think that any of this is going to pan out.
Peter Mansoor, I want to talk about where the United States goes to from here. We heard Secretary Blinken talk about the counter-terrorism war, which still continues. You know, they've been using words like conducting this war over the horizon. This is what the Pentagon spokesman said about that earlier today. Let's listen.
The President has made it very clear that we will maintain robust over-the-horizon counterterrorism capability, the kinds of capabilities that you've seen us use in just the last 24, 36 hours, and we'll have the ability to act in ways that are in keeping with our national security interests and help prevent attacks on the homeland. We still have that capability. We will use that capability.
So, Peter, what do you make of these tactics? I mean, that kind of war poses little or absolutely no risk to the United States, but still poses enormous risks to Afghan civilians. I mean, they would still be living with the fear that these bombs could come raining down on them at any time. We just saw what happened over the past 2 days when a bomb, which was ostensibly dropped on terrorists, actually, we understand, killed a family, including 7 children.
Well, he's referring to the robust drone capability that the United States possesses. Some of these long-range drones can be launched from Navy platforms or from bases in the Middle East, and they can reach Afghanistan. They don't have as much loiter time over the region because it's so far to get there. But what we really have lost when we withdrew from Afghanistan is our intelligence network. We've lost all the human intelligence that we had, and a lot of the signals intelligence as well. So finding targets is going to be really, really difficult. I think you're going to see the number of drone strikes in Afghanistan and Western Pakistan decrease significantly now that the United States has withdrawn from the region. Now, the other thing I would say about the drone strike that killed the civilians, it killed, or it targeted a vehicle borne improvised explosive device. And when it destroyed it, all the explosives blew up and killed civilians in the area. That's just part of war. The law of war doesn't say you can't kill civilians. It just says that collateral damage has to be commensurate with the military advantage gained. And preventing a car bomb from reaching the airport at that point in time, I think, was worth the strike.
Yeah, but Peter, if the United States tells us that it takes precautions when it launches these attacks to make sure that it would minimize the number of civilians killed, if they know that this particular vehicle is in an urban area which is populated by civilians, that it may or may not have had bombs, that the likelihood of these bombs killing civilians was pretty high, should this attack have been carried out?
Well, the alternative is to let the people in the car bomb drive it into the airport and explode it at one of the checkpoints or gates, which would have also killed people. So you're making judgment calls. And in my view, it was a good call to make that strike.
Should there be an investigation into this? We understand that there were children as young as 2 years old who were killed in this attack, and if there is an investigation, should people be held accountable for it?
Well, the Department of Defense has already said they will investigate it. Yeah. But again, I would say if you did destroy a car bomb that was going to target the airport, the strike was worth it, regardless of the collateral damage. Now they couldn't predict the civilian deaths in that instance because the people were probably in buildings and so forth. But these are tough calls. Yeah. And they're not all clean strikes. Okay. And this is going to be an issue going forward as well, now that we've lost our eyes and ears in Afghanistan.
Right, Peter, I just want to get on to something else, which was another very disturbing report on U.S. military behavior in Kabul, and that was about the suicide bomb that killed 170 people, including 13 United States servicemen. It now transpires, according to witnesses, according to relatives on the ground, that a number of those people died from gunfire that came from American troops. In fact, a number of the people who died were found to have bullet wounds.
Yeah, well, this is something that will also be investigated. The reports I heard was that it was a suicide bomber plus gunmen in the crowd who were ISIS-K members, yeah, who were targeting military personnel who then fired back. But we don't know. All of this is third-hand reporting, and we're going to have to wait for the official investigation to occur and for people who were actually there to say what happened.
Ahmad Shah Mohibi, we heard Secretary Blinken tell us there that of that UN resolution that has been passed in the Security Council, it was led by France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, and that UN resolution would create, quote, a safe zone in Kabul to allow safe passage for people who want to get out. What do you know about that, and any idea of how that would work?
Well, before we get into that, Secretary Blinken just recognized the Taliban as a government. I think the same thing happened when Colin Powell announced that the al-Baghdadi in 2003, following the Iraq invasion, al-Baghdadi just promoted, and everybody around the world that started cherishing his name. I'm thinking that the Taliban will take the Secretary Blinken's word that how he called us as a government, and they're going to start campaigning. I think the security and the safe passage for the immigration, for the refugees, is the best alternative. My organization, and we're trying to work with the other organizations, bringing people, started vetting processing for eligible SIVs and applicants, being able to have them secure all in one locations, and then from there, other countries and other host nations will be able to allow them with visas so they could immigrate. I think this would prevent a disaster, and I wish a plan like that would have been put in place months ago by the administration. But I feel that the Taliban at this point, they are off the legitimacy in the world. They will do whatever it takes for them to get those gains. And I think that would be the best alternative. We have green cards, SIVs. I'm sure they will get out of Afghanistan one way or another. But we're talking about allied and those who risk their lives. They're in high threat. In that camp refugees, it's too early to say where, but we're talking about thousands of people. And it's also important for the international community. Resolution of UN nation is really good, but action is the most important thing. I think international community, IRC, and many others need to engage and go to Afghanistan and provide food, healthcare for these refugees that are seeking for their lives. I think that's the most important thing.
Said Khan, Ahmad Shah Mohibi raises an important point there, and that is the legitimacy of the current government in Afghanistan right now, the Taliban government. They were not elected. They came to power at the end of a gun. And the United States recognizes them. What does that tell us?
Well, I think we have to see first when formal recognition will occur. Second of all, the United States had already been negotiating with the Taliban in Doha. They had been negotiating with the Taliban before 9/11, as a matter of fact. So the idea of, on the one hand, having them designated as a terrorist organization and yet at the same time negotiating with them demonstrates the ambiguity and at the same time the complexity of geopolitics. At the same time, we have to recognize that in the 1990s, there were only 3 countries that recognized the Taliban as a legitimate government of Afghanistan. It was Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. Now we are on the threshold of several countries, including superpowers and ones that hold permanent seats on the UN Security Council, looking to formally recognize the Taliban regime, China and Russia respectively. So the game has changed rather dramatically. And again, as Dr. Hashimi said, whether or not the United States then puts its imprimatur on this is perhaps a race that's already been run. And the point that was made regarding having some kind of NGO engagement with Afghanistan in order to reach the people who need help mostly when it comes to food and aid. In order for that to happen, we have to recognize then that the gatekeepers to Afghanistan are in fact the Taliban. And so if the mission really is to provide humanitarian aid, that has to be taken into consideration.
Okay, well, as I said, it's been a day of fast-breaking news developments concerning Afghanistan. We want to turn now to our reporter on the ground in Afghanistan, Zamayalai Abbasin. Is there in Kabul right now. What can you tell us about the reaction in Kabul now that the U.S. has pulled out?
Hello, Anand. The reactions are different. Those who cannot trust Taliban or fearful and still in panic that what would Taliban do, the Taliban are trying to make everybody sure that they will be responsible, accountable, and nobody should be afraid of them. But last 20 years, there were much more incidents from the Taliban. That's why the people have rights to be afraid. And on the other hand, the villages, particularly, the people are celebrating this moment. And I've been in contact. I am getting messages from all around the several provinces of Afghanistan that people see this as a victory, as an Independence Day, and the August 30 is a celebration day for many people, including the Taliban. So this is the era that is brought by a dramatic change, full of chaos, Kabul airport, catastrophes, and all those 20 years that Afghanistan people have been through, all now coming to an end. And there is another chapter. The Taliban seek serious cooperation with region and the world, particularly with the United States and allies. They've been continuously talking about this, and they say they have no enmity with anybody, and Taliban have much more challenges. Every one of this is really hard to tackle, and that it's now up to the Taliban and also the regional and international cooperation. The Taliban member are still their fate, or because of the United Nations Security Council, the blacklist and sanctions are still unsolved. Yeah. ISKP is emerging in the country and claiming much more responsibility of the recent bloody attacks, including one in Kabul airport, and much more like economic, social, and political issues ahead of the Taliban political office and their leadership.
Right. You know, I know that it's the early hours of the morning, Tuesday morning there in Kabul, where you are right now. In fact, we could hear the call to prayer behind your voice there. What is the security situation like in Kabul right now?
The situation is calm. We were witnessing a shot 4 hours earlier when the U.S. left, and there were thousands of bullets just flying on over the sky of Kabul, and people were afraid. They had no idea what's going on. And then the situation now, the bullets and all the shootings that were the Taliban were celebrating their victory. Then their leaders came on the scene. They got the communication and told stop it, because people were fear, and this is not a good reaction. So that's enough. Then the situation now, we still have a little bit bullet shots in some parts of Kabul, and there is a new day starting in Afghanistan, and particularly for the people of Kabul, and they are facing currently an Afghanistan without any foreign boots reportedly, and the U.S. and allied forces have already left Afghanistan with much more challenges.
So the situation right now, the Taliban is now in charge, but they take control of the country at a very, very challenging time. We know that the economy has been battered and that the country also still continues to face security threats. We heard from some of our other guests that this could erupt in a civil war at some stage. But what kind of control does the Taliban have right now? Have they taken hold of any of the sort of civil administrative duties right now?
Yes, Taliban have been appointing several of its members, like the Afghanistan Bank or the central bank governor, who is leading this role as acting governor of the DAB or the Afghanistan Bank. At the same time, we've been hearing that they have appointed a commission for education.
I am sorry, we have lost our correspondent there in Kabul. We will try to get back to him, but let's move on with our panel right now. And Nadia, as I was saying to our correspondent in Afghanistan, the country faces enormous challenges. The major among them, of course, is economic. It also faces a very serious humanitarian crisis. We know that the up to 14 million Afghans face serious, severe hunger. How serious is this?
Well, it's desperate. I think that Afghanistan is a country that has been suffering from layered catastrophes. So we've got COVID on top of poverty, on top of conflict, and on top of now just truly mass confusion, uncertainty, and a withdrawal of a lot of presence of foreign organizations, people who had been on the ground helping, providing care, providing access. And a lot of the donations have really shrunk away because people have been looking at a period of uncertainty. We've got organizations whose funding has really almost dried out because people are wondering, is it worth it? Am I donating to a cause that's actually going to have any effect? The Taliban really are going to be in need desperately of international support in order to provide these things for the country, because they're not really a structure that has any capacity whatsoever. But the dollars or the money that be flowing in, the question is how much of a cut of it are they going to take? How much of it are they going to impede? Because they're going to be looking to also build themselves and create some kind of organization.
Peter Mansoor, what kind of leverage does the United States retain over the Taliban right now? I mean, we heard earlier on, and I mentioned it to one of our other guests, that the United States can stop aid going to Afghanistan. They can also withdraw international recognition. But is that going to be enough?
Well, the West as a whole has enormous leverage. Look, the Taliban, congratulations, you're now the government, but you're also broke. 3/4 or more of the budget of the previous Afghan government came from outside sources. And although China and Russia want to have deep ties with the Taliban and do have good relations, it's unclear whether China and Russia are willing to put forward the sort of economic resources that the United States and its allies provided to the Taliban. So this is the leverage we have. If the Taliban actually follows through on its good words and plays nice and lets people leave if they want to, and has an inclusive government and doesn't treat people unfairly and respects women's rights and so forth, then the aid will flow, the money will flow, and if not, then the Taliban's going to have a really hard time putting together a government that's going to actually be able to govern the country.
Well, in fact, China has already said that it's willing to help development in Afghanistan right now. It's involved very closely with Pakistan on the border of Afghanistan with its CPEC project there. And it would seem that Afghanistan would be an ideal candidate for China's Belt and Road Initiative, which seeks to revitalize those old trade routes in Central Asia. So in terms of how this changes the geopolitical strategic balance in that part of the world, what's happened now that the U.S. has left?
Well, it's clear that Pakistan has gained a very valuable ally and strategic depth in its rear as it considers India its foremost strategic competitor. Iran is in an interesting situation now that it has the Taliban back in charge on its borders. But China and Russia really are the big winners here, and China especially. You mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative. I'm sure the Taliban would be very willing to host development projects on its soil. What I was referring to in terms of economic aid was not just development aid, but this sort of day-to-day, year-to-year, here's $80 billion to help balance your budget and put people to work. And this is what the Taliban, they've got to figure out an economy that works for Afghanistan. Right now, their major export is opium. So they've got a long road to hoe, and they'll need a lot of outside support from the regional actors for sure, but I think also from the West.
Saeed Khan, how will Pakistan be looking at these developments in neighboring Afghanistan? I mean, would they be seeing it as a major victory?
Well, in three different dimensions, yes. Number one, as you had alluded to, the stability that it brings to CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, a $60 billion investment that China has made going all the way from its border with Afghanistan down to the deep water port that it has developed at Gwadar in Pakistan. Second of all, having the Taliban in power in Kabul yet again is going to be seen as certainly a victory for the Pakistan ISI, the very powerful internal security and intelligence service. And third, with the Taliban in power, it means that its, of course, arch rival India no longer has leverage in Afghanistan. And that's going to have two different consequences. One, of course, with the diminished role of India perhaps opening up another front and a proxy war for Pakistan from Afghanistan. And the other is its impact on the United States and its so-called Quad, the mutual defense pact that the United States has with India, with Japan, and Australia to serve as a bulwark against a Chinese expansion. Given India's rather inept performance militarily last summer in a couple of border engagements with China, given its mishandling of COVID-19 and given its own economic issues, that is going to perhaps cause Washington to reconsider then whether the Quad is the most viable strategy that it has vis-a-vis China, which again will be seen then as a victory for China and a victory for Pakistan as well.
But how closely would Pakistan want to get involved with Afghanistan as it is now, Saeed? Because, I mean, just look at the situation right now. The country, Afghanistan that is facing a massive refugee crisis, and many people who have not been able to make it to the airport and get out on planes from this landlocked country have headed to the Pakistan border, and we are hearing from Pakistani authorities that they cannot accommodate them. They are already accommodating up to 2 million Afghans right now, but no more.
Well, we saw this happening during the Soviet invasion from 1979 to 1989. Pakistan absorbed 3 million refugees, and of course, it was then the birthplace of the Taliban in refugee camps within Pakistan. What Pakistan then is going to have to recognize is that the stabilization of Afghanistan is within Pakistan's national security interests, not only to provide some kind of mitigation of the refugee issue, but also to put some kind of a damper on ISIS-K. Pakistan has as much to lose as does a Taliban-led Afghanistan with a resurgent ISIS-K and al-Qaeda. So this may then be yet another area of cooperation with ISI and with the Taliban in Kabul.
Ahmad Shah Mohibi, this is already a huge refugee crisis, but should Western countries be doing more, especially NATO countries?
Absolutely, yes. I think every Afghan that work with NATO, ISAF, and the broader international community should give a passage, should given visas, and should go to third country and be vetted and processed and taken them under the international law, Geneva Convention. Each one of these Afghans have the right to. Because at the end, it's too early to understand and analyze whether the Taliban are going to hurt these people or not. But I could assure you that the Afghan Special Forces, commandos, some judges, and some commanders are on the target list. We saw the Taliban nightly execution of these people. It started it. One thing we do not understand and we do not see in the Western world is that Taliban has a strong rule over media. The media has been censored, like the North Korea and the communist regimes. Yeah. So what you see is what the Taliban feed you. So it's kind of like the internet. what you see is kind of like the digital analytics. So the Taliban are giving you is, I think the international community needs to work diplomatically with Afghanistan. I think refugee crisis, not only by the Taliban, it's working with Pakistan, India, Iran, making sure they build refugee camps in Tajikistan, Uzbekistan. They should, and they have every responsibility. They started this war. They created this war. Afghans paid the price. Osama bin Laden was found in Pakistan, killed in Pakistan. Now it's time to not leave them behind and build them on them.
Nadia, of course, there are thousands of Afghans who worked with the United States military, who worked with U.S. contractors in Afghanistan. They are either now in the United States, they've been flown here over the last few days, or they're heading to the United States. Is there any kind of infrastructure, social infrastructure, that exists now to help integrate them into the country, to help resettle them here?
There is some infrastructure. To be honest, we are actually building an infrastructure as we go. And when I say we, I mean there's a collaboration between multiple federal agencies at the state level, task forces that have been created in New Jersey, for example. We've really made a lot of headway there. Municipal level as well. I'm part of Afghan-American Foundation. We are an organization that is looking to link these other diaspora organizations from coast to coast. Afghans across the United States have already been creating community-based organizations. So we are working to provide translation services on the ground level, organize donations, help provide car rides to people who are landing and need to get from one place to another. So it's a network of individuals, faith-based organizations, just communities, and really just good people that are coming together. But it is hectic, it is chaotic. No one expected this number of people to come in such a short period of time. So it is taxing, it's exhausting, it's grueling to all the volunteers and people who are showing up to do this. But this is truly where humanity is showing itself.
Peter Mansoor, I've just got a minute left, and I want to ask you this. We are approaching the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, which were the attacks that triggered off this war in the first place. After 2 decades of war in Afghanistan, has the United States prevailed in this war on terror? And if part of that was winning hearts and minds, where does it stand?
Well, it's a mixed bag. There has not been another attack in the West on the scale of 9/11. In that sense, the war on terror bought us time to build our defenses, which are now very robust against attacks in the United States, other than lone wolf attacks. On the other hand, the cost has been enormous. Not only in Americans killed, but Iraqis killed, Afghans killed, and the cost in terms of trillions of dollars of spending. So, you know, I think when the Americans look back on this 20 years, I think if we could do it over again, we would do it differently. So again, a very mixed bag in the war on terror.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us on the show. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.